Okay, thanks for joining this webinar on hope-based communications organised by the International Civil Society Centre in partnership with Thomas Coombes. I'm the communications manager at the International Civil Society Centre, and with me is Thomas from the newly formed Hope-Based Communications. Before setting up Hope-Based Communications as an independent consultancy, Thomas was head of brand and deputy communications director at Amnesty. So a little bit about the centre. The centre is owned by 15 of the largest ICSOs who across environmental, human rights and social justice and humanitarian issues together work to improve people's lives. We also make partnerships with other organisations and platforms from civil society, such as academia, media, and social business. The centre plays three roles. We're a convener. We hold events and workshops for groups such as CEOs from ICSOs to much larger events, such as Global Perspectives. This year that's in Addis, and we'll be looking at CSO legitimacy and impact of ICSOs in times of scrutiny. We also look for innovation in the sector, and we try to propagate them, for example, through our Scanning the Horizon community. And we also facilitate collaborations, such as the Leave No One Behind project, which is an SDG monitoring and implementation project. It involves around 12 international civil society organizations and several national CSOs in 5 different countries. So a little bit of background to this webinar. Thomas and the Centre have been collaborating since February, where Thomas came to our Innovators Forum. And we convened civil society innovators to explore the area of reframing the narrative in response to challenges from the global rise of populist and nationalist political agendas. What came out of that was a desire from attendees to gather the communication directors from ICSOs. And in September, we'll meet in Berlin and explore how we can practically use hope-based communications to reach new audiences, sharing what works and what doesn't work in campaigns and solidarity messaging in times of crisis. So this webinar is a learning opportunity, and we'd like to use this as a jumping off point for that meeting. So if you are interested about that meeting or any of our other work, please take a look at our website, or you can email me at my email address. So without much further ado, I would like to hand over the control of the webinar to Thomas. If you give me a moment. So I think you're in control now, Thomas.
Yeah, just like the UK after Brexit, taking control. Great, so hopefully you can all see the first slide. Maybe Thomas, just let me know.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, great. All right, thanks everyone for taking the time for this. Really nice to be with you all, and thanks also to Thomas and the Centre for hosting this. So I'm going to take you through a sort of taster of hope-based communications and also show some videos. This is born out of my reaction to both what's been happening in the world and then also reading about narrative and framing and neuroscience and cognitive linguistics, and having a strong desire to actually raise the question to me, what is our narrative? What is the message that we want people to know, and basically a desire to stop reacting to what the other side was saying. I'm going to use a loose term and say the other side or the opposition in a sort of vague term, but I hope you'll get what I mean. More in common talk these days about not having left or right, but more people who want an open world and people who want a closed world. So it might be helpful to think in those terms. So I'm going to basically, as I started to apply narrative shifts myself, I realized that these are really simple things, simple shifts that all of us can do in our day-to-day communication. And so I developed them into 5 basic shifts that everyone can apply to their work. And it's very much not just about communications, although it does put communications right at the heart of social change work, because it's about creating long-term changes in people's attitudes. But this is also about making our policies acceptable and making policymakers more likely to actually put in place the measures we want. So it's basically winning more support to our cause, but also making the case for the change we want to see. So I'm going to take you through these 5 shifts this morning. The first one is a very basic one. Obviously, it's about moving from fear to hope. And there's quite a lot of really interesting writing out there at the moment about how damaging fear is, and it obviously goes without saying that we can see how the populists use it. But fear is also very much related to other negative emotions that are damaging for society, particularly democratic societies. Disgust, which we know also then leads to dehumanization, to anger and division, and also actually to shame and guilt. And what I started doing is actually realizing that obviously we use quite a lot of fear and anger, sometimes in a desire to create outrage and make people share the outrage we feel about things that are happening in the world, but also potentially inadvertently triggering fear. And while that might get short-term results, in the long term, if you want to organize a movement, you actually need more positive emotions. And that's why I have this saying, anger mobilizes, but hope organizes. And so my immediate response to what was starting to happen around 2016 was to respond with quite negative messaging. Essentially, we're saying this is a nightmare. You may remember, we'll come back to it, a certain inspiring leader of the 20th century who told people, I have a dream. But the human rights movement seems to be a bit more focused on telling people what our nightmare is. And the problem is, the human rights movement was built on showing the world its worst nightmares. The strategy is called name and shame, or you mobilize shame. But the challenge is, what do you do when leaders are shameless? What do you do when leaders not only are shameless, but actually go out of their way to seek the fights with NGOs in order to build publicity, where any publicity for them is good publicity? It just drowns out the opposition and makes it impossible for any politician to operate in any way other than in reacting to what they say. And so one indirect cost of this is that politicians who actually do the right thing, who do what we want them to do, are invisible and don't get seen. And there's also a trend called confirmation bias, which tells us that if people feel a certain way or think about the world in a certain way because of their lived experience or who people who influence them speak, and we just use facts to tell them they're wrong, not only will we not change their mind, we will actually reinforce them in that opinion. And the sort of political ideas around people's emotions are backed up by new findings from neuroscience, which I'm going to summarize very, very briefly, but you can always follow up if you want to know more. But the basic summary is thinking of the brain as an upstairs and a downstairs brain. And the downstairs brain is the part that's triggered when the brain, again, based on its understanding of the world and its your previous experiences, interprets a message or a signal as a threat. And then it's triggering your survival instincts. This is where worry, stress, and anxiety reside. And it's also triggering the release of cortisol, which blocks off your rational thought. That resides, along with empathy, in the upper part of the brain. And usually in our movements, we want to trigger empathy for the people we're trying to help. But we usually do it with a message that either has an implicit threat or fear or guilt. Either imagine if this happened to you, or you should do something about this, and feel guilty if you don't. And that's actually triggering a part of the brain that's different from where the empathy that we want resides. And also those positive emotions that we need actually to drive people to action. For example, comedy and humor have been shown to trigger empathy more easily than, say, anger. What's also important for us to note, thinking about the brain, is how ideas and ways of seeing the world are stronger the more they're activated and triggered. And actually they're like neurons or muscles fusing in the brain that they basically become stronger with use. So Michelle Obama once said, when they go low, we go high. That applies directly to the findings from neuroscience. So if we are creating a society that's full of fear, division, and anxiety, we are laying the table for populists. Whereas the society we want to see, in which there's more openness, tolerance, and kindness, actually needs people to feel more abundance, confidence, and joy. So that relates, for example, to both the environment, but also most progressive economic policies that involve sharing. The more we use language that talks about scarcity, that economic crisis, lack of money, that's creating a sense of scarcity where people are thinking, well, we can't invest money in this because maybe I'll run out of, there'll be less money for me later. Whereas if we use messaging around more of abundance, whereas there's so much richness and resources on our planet, we can do a better job of sharing it out equally. So that's a very basic example of framing. The context in which people see an issue or a policy debate will decide which side they come down on. And so there's a challenge for us in the human rights movement is if this basic principle, and in other movements, the basic principle there is you need to make people feel good. Feeling good is a political act. But how do we make people feel joyous or happy or confident when there are so many terrible things happening in the world? There's a good example from Chile in 1988 when Augusto Pinochet held a referendum on whether or not he would stay in power, and people weren't planning to vote. They assumed it would be rigged and it would be even dangerous for them to vote. And the opposition planned to run a series of ads documenting the scale of his abuses, the torture, the disappearances. But then there's a movie about this called No, with Gael Garcia Bernal. They had an advertising guy propose them something different. And I'm going to play you a little bit of it. But essentially, it was an ad called Chile Happiness is Coming. And I need to give you a bit of a warning that this was filmed in the 1980s, so it might seem a little bit funny. But the basic principle is that it was showing people a picture of what freedom looked like.
Porque diga lo que diga, yo soy libre de pensar, porque siento que es la hora de ganar la libertad. Hasta cuando ya de abusos es el tiempo de cambiar, porque basta de miseria, voy a decir que no, porque nace el arcoíris.
So I'm just going to leave it at that point for now. I'm going to circulate a playlist later where you can watch all the videos in full. And I see it's slightly slow when it's sharing the screen. But essentially what you were seeing there was, in a country that had suffered dictatorship for a decade, this gave people a new picture in their head of something they weren't able to imagine, which was a world of freedom. And you can see it's using very everyday imagery. You've got people hugging, which is really important as well. And above all the characters are smiling, which we mirror the emotions of the people we see. So this ad aims to give people hope. And that's actually what it succeeded in doing. The opposition only had 15 minutes of advertising time. So it was really precious what the message was. And obviously their campaign slogan was no, which doesn't sound very positive, but they turned it into something that people were singing in the streets. So the lesson here is, how do we give people a sense that the change we want to see is both desirable but also possible, and so that they actually get involved, because the messages of fear are risk giving people a sense of despondency. But since then, our movements have kind of left behind a little bit that kind of hopeful imagery. And a lot of the time we're reporting on crises using the same imagery that the other side are using. And so their message is that we have a crisis. our message is that we face the greatest humanitarian crisis since the end of the Second World War. That's basically both messaging, telling people they need to be afraid. The problem is, when people feel afraid, they want a strong man to keep them safe. And so our message, our solution to that crisis was we need safe and legal routes. Their message was build a wall. And if both sides were using the language of tides, flows, and the key thing here is this language appears even in academic or legal writing. So there's sometimes a tendency in our movement to think that we can just use facts and rational thought and trigger rational thinking in our audience, and that our messaging will be neutral if it seems legalistic and academic. The problem is that frames exist no matter what. So, for example, a lot of legal terms, we have terms about managing refugee flows. Right in there is already a metaphor that calls to mind rising water levels. And what do you do when water levels rise? You build a wall. So the key thing is we really need to learn, thinking back to the brain, that we might use a word or value or concept like, say, justice. It means one thing to us, but it will mean something different to our audience depending on their lived experience, and also depending on the people who influence them. So, for example, there's research that shows if the leader of your country, say, for example, tweets racist things that are against your values, it may actually encourage unconscious racist ideas in yourself, even if you don't want it to. So, for example, Donald Trump this weekend tweeted obscene racist things. He obviously is making himself unpopular with his opposition. His base on its own right now isn't enough for him to win the election. He's actually trying to shift more people in the middle ground to a more racist position in the hope of building his base. Basically shifting more people to his viewpoint. So we need to show people a different image. Basically what's happening here, there's an idea called the Overton Window, that through repetition, ideas that are unthinkable or radical can be shifted to be seen as acceptable and sensible, and eventually to the point where they become policy. So we've seen over the last 5 years around the world, but particularly in Europe, ideas that were completely unthinkable have suddenly become mainstream politics. So a few weeks ago, the Danish Social Democrat Party won an election on an anti-immigration platform. On the one hand, this is quite depressing, particularly because we have inadvertently helped this process, because someone would say something that was completely unthinkable to us, and we would respond by saying, this is outrageous. Did you hear what Donald Trump just said? He said this. This is what he said. Here's why we're against it. And that means the debate was constantly repeating their messages and not ours. So the positive thing we can take from this is that right now there are ideas that are precious to us that are unthinkable and radical in so-called mainstream public opinion. So, for example, centrist politicians are now saying it's wrong to have migration, that more parties should be strong in migration, essentially following public opinion rather than leading it, but crucially following their opinion, their interpretation of public opinion. The key thing we need to know is that middle of the road audiences can hold both ideas at the same time, that people should be able to move, but that also they're worried about the risks. And it's not a case of proving the other side's arguments wrong. It's about a case of activating our way of thinking more in their mind. And so if we actually get back on point and do a better job of making the case for the things we want to see, and crucially talking about them in a way that captures people's imagination and gets people talking about it, even if that means people criticizing us, we can shift ideas that feel important to us, but perhaps not acceptable today, to the point where they will again become policy. So for example, whether it's talking about a world where people are able to move, a world that's built on sustainable energy, a world where we take care of each other. So that's what hope-based communications is all about. We have huge amounts of increasingly accessible tools to understand how people think. And the other side are using that to exploit it, to exploit people's fears. So targeting content to people based on their Facebook profile, putting exactly the images or the issues in front of them that will make them feel scared. What we need to do we can't fight fear and anger with fear and anger, because we will create an environment that is conducive to that world they want. We need to make people feel hopeful and positive about their future. And there's research that actually shows that does people feeling confident about their future makes them more welcoming. The key thing is, hope is not about feeling good necessarily, it's about the belief that things can get better. And indeed, the belief that they have to get better. So when we're not going to use our audience research to just find out where people are and say what we think they want to hear. It's about understanding how do we make them agree with the things we believe. So it's about making popular what needs to be said. And so that's for me why the starting point to look at narrative and framing and more sophisticated ways of understanding audiences is to actually start by articulating what is it that we stand for. And so much of the time we dedicate huge amounts of resources to documenting and talking about the things we're against and criticizing the behavior we don't want to see in the world. And we need to spend more of that time looking actually at the things we do want to see, and also celebrating the behavior we want to see, because this comes back to the neuroscience. There's an article I can share around you that I've recently published, a series on positive narratives on open global rights, which shows that basically if you document abuses without also showing an alternative way of behaving, not only will that become the new reference point for people, so they accept it as the norm. It's normal that these horrible things happen, that's just how humans are. It might actually also simulate that unacceptable behavior because they're seeing someone in their perceived in-group carrying something out. It becomes normalized and socialized for them. So then again, there's a risk there, and that's why we need to start modeling the behavior we want to see. I'm going to very briefly introduce you to the sort of two masters of framing and narrative who you should look at if you want to know more about them and where a lot of these ideas come from. But so the basic message here is from the title of this book, Don't Think of an Elephant, because essentially we're constantly, and this is a saying that Anat, the author on the left, says, what you fight, you feed. So obviously we try and call out the things we're against, but we're actually just reactivating them in people's minds. But crucially, it's not just that we constantly refer to the things we want people to not support. Not only that, we use language systems. So for example, language of natural disasters when we talk about refugees that put people already in the wrong frame of mind. With this book on the economy that Anat Shenker-Sawyer has written, she says that we talk about the economy like it's a person who can get sick. So if someone proposes a minimum wage, they'll say, oh, that's a good idea, but it might harm the economy. So basically we end up in this situation where the economy has to come before our well-being. But then the crucial point that comes from George Lakoff is also an idea of worldviews. And he talks about a strict parent worldview and a nurturing parent. So he says the strict parent, which is basically the conservative way of seeing the world, thinks that if you take care of people, you'll make them soft. So actually you need tough love. If someone is unemployed, they need to find their own way. You can't help them. They have to, it's like the baby has to be allowed to cry and learn to take care of itself. Whereas a nurturing parent believes in taking responsibility for other people. On a more sort of anthropological level, you could see that strict parent worldview believes that humans are individuals, independent, who it's human nature to just look after yourself. It's where neoliberal theory comes from, the idea that the best way to contribute to society is just look after your own interests. Whereas there's a lot of writing now, for example, Yuval Harari says human nature is actually to operate in a group and take care of each other. And these basic ideas about how the world works underlie not only how ordinary people think and vote, but also how decision makers choose what policies to put in place. But coming on to the basic point of George Lakoff's Don't Think of an Elephant, if you look at how large numbers of progressive groups message, this phrase comes up time and time again: something is not a crime. So we say when journalists get locked up, we respond, journalism is not a crime. When we're trying to get access to healthcare for women, we say abortion is not a crime. Women who get abortions are not criminals. With the crackdown on civil space, we say defending human rights is not a crime. Human rights defenders are not criminals. Migration is not a crime. And you can see this constantly coming up time and time again. But the point that what we really need to be aware of from a linguistic point of view is that the word not here is soft, essentially. It doesn't register in the brain. What you have is two concepts, human rights and crime. And so what we're essentially doing is fusing those two concepts in the mind of our audience. And there's a lot of surveys now that show people's basic understanding of human rights is that it's something to defend criminals. What we're also not doing is saying what human rights actually is. What is journalism if it's not a crime? We're not putting that alternative idea in the mind of our audience. We're essentially just inviting a debate on whether or not migration is a crime, whether or not love is a crime. And we're not actually building up the attitudes we want to see. And this is brought to life not just in the words we use, which put a very clear picture in people's head. We actually take it one step further, and this is a case of an Amnesty International piece of activism. When one of Amnesty's staff was in jail, the head of the Belgian sector literally went in a cage. Let me demonstrate for you what the Turkish government is doing. They're putting us in a cage. But when the other side say that activists are criminals or that migrants and refugees are animals, and then they act on that impulse and put people in a cage, they are actually reinforcing that dehumanization in the minds of our audience. And that puts a really tough challenge in front of the people who want to fight that behavior. Because first of all, what you fight, you feed. But if we send amazing researchers to go and investigate these crimes and document them, if we put images of migrants in cages in front of our audiences, are we inadvertently reinforcing that dehumanization? And so the challenge there is, how do we also show alternative images? So not just saying that journalism should not be a crime, but actually saying how journalists should be treated. And there we're also shifting to the audiences seeing their own role in the change. There's a challenge here that I found myself when I just started to challenge myself on not just saying what I'm against, but also what I'm for. So Amnesty's, for example, main goals are fighting the death penalty and torture, among others. It's very hard to talk about a world without the death penalty or a world without torture without defining that as the absence of the thing you're against. And when you start to push through the logic of, well, what do we want instead? In terms of the death penalty, you're actually saying everyone deserves a second chance, no matter how heinous their crime. And that's quite a hard thing to message. But what we need to do is start building campaigns that actually build up support for those basic ideas. So, for example, in Florida, in the midterm elections, the last midterm elections in 2018, they actually, by around 60%, had people vote to give felons back the vote with a message, Floridians believe in second chances. So when you shift from talking about what you're against to what you're for, it starts to open up avenues to actually start to talk about your values and the underlying values that support the changes you want to see without necessarily having to go directly into the issues and use messages like there is no evidence that the death penalty is a deterrent to crime, which is basically accepting that, making the debate all about what's the best way to punish crime rather than more the fact that we want to give second chances to people. And that was a line that human rights organizations still use today, even though it was used by a presidential candidate, Mike Dukakis, in 1988, in a way that actually cost him the election. I want to show you an example of making this shift from Ireland. So the LGBT movement has shifted away from using the language of discrimination and human rights to actually make the case to shift people's attitudes on LGBTQ plus the communities. And they made a specific strategic choice to focus on equal marriage because it was something that would change how people who thought they didn't know anyone from that community, and they had this perception of that community as being a sort of living in the cities, a sort of hedonistic lifestyle. And by focusing on people's desire to just live together and basically love and take care of each other, people were able to relate to each other. And so the campaign in Ireland was a very good example because it became something that straight, heterosexual, old conservative men were invited to also be a supporter of. So you had Men for Yes, Grandfathers for Yes, you had rugby players coming in and supporting it. So great changes were brought about by making the debate around what we're for, so making a modern, generous, loving, inclusive Ireland, rather than saying let's not discriminate, but also by showing people like them changing their mind. And I think I'm going to skip the video for now, but I'm going to share it on YouTube later so you can see, because it's a very powerful video. It also makes me emotional, so that would slow me down if I show it now. But I feel there's a key lesson for other movements is that the Pride movement has created something positive that people can stand for. So they've made it easy for supporters to support them and get on board and basically wear their colors with pride. So if you are definitely walking around London the last few weeks, pretty much every shop has redone its brand in the pride colors. But human rights today, and among other causes, and also civil society in general, is seen as very heavy and political. It's not something people feel a great desire to get involved in. Indeed, we've done some social listening, both for human rights and civil society. The dominant emotion associated with those words on social media is one of despair. And so basically almost the vast majority of conversation around civil society right now is one of civil society fighting governments or being cracked down on by governments. And so there's no other conversation around civil society that is positive. Most of that chatter comes from the NGOs. It's obviously not a word that's used in general conversation very often. But the challenge for us is if we don't actually talk about civil society in any other way than a group of people being cracked down on or fighting governments, then how will people have ever any other understanding of us other than a group of professionals, a group of professional activists? Because civil society really should be about all of us, but the way we currently talk about it doesn't give people that idea. And the key thing that we can start to see at play when we start to look at what we're for and the values that we're for is that actually all our different movements may work on different issues, but actually the attitudes that we need to be stronger in society for us to succeed are the same. So this is an example of a conservation organization taking a stand on LGBT rights and saying we need a world of love, respect, and equality. And I'll show you how human rights and the environmental movement can overlap in a little bit. But this is an example that a group called Common Cause like to talk about, because they're saying that we, as in our movements, need to look at how the opposition are actually quite united. They may be nationalists, but they work together across borders because they share certain values and they help each other reinforce them. And so these big changes in narrative, right now, it sounds unthinkable, as you remember from the Overton Window, to suggest that love and respect should be on the same weight on the balance as the economy and security, because that's the way people talk right now. But what we start seeing is leaders now talking a lot more about humanity. We see ideas like the Green New Deal being put on the table. That will only come about, those narratives will only shift if we all have the same message and we keep pushing it. These new ideas about how the world works. So essentially, values unite, issues divide. Great example of that is just looking at Europe. 2014, you'll see the big issues around Europe basically was the economy, healthcare, unemployment. But you'll see in the last election, huge shift. It's all about immigration and terrorism. The other side pick issues that will help them drive their values. They pick issues that divide us, that make us think of each other in smaller groups, highlight our differences between human beings. Also, they highlight messages that make issues. They want issues to be discussed higher on the agenda than, they basically want immigration higher on the agenda than the economy, because those are issues that make people feel insecure and then move to their messages of fear. But also because they want messages that show government doesn't work, because they want a low government society. And so when the debate's all about healthcare, that's all about the state caring for people. George Lakoff says that the worldview that best supports conservative policies is one of fear. And the more progressives trigger fear, the more they're actually helping conservatives. our response has to be to trigger a different worldview of empathy and of responsibility to care for others. So we also, our instinct right now is whatever issue gets put on the table by the opposition. For example, they're trying to put abortion on the table in Norway, countries where you really wouldn't expect it to. Our response is to react to it and fight back. We then help the other side by keeping it high on the agenda. What we need to start doing, which is what the Democrats did very well in the last midterm elections, is keep the issues focused on issues that bring to activate our way of seeing the world. And we can talk about that more in Q&A. But so the key point here then is we need to stop just talking about the problems, but also show people solutions. And this is where policy is so important, because it's about showing people how our solutions will work and how the world will look once we put those solutions in place. Basically, what people need, the darker the moment, the more you need that hope, because you need to believe that there's an alternative possibility. So, for example, you can prove to people that austerity is a disaster, but until people are ready to support public spending, you're not actually going to get rid of it. So we need to spend more time making the case for our alternative. And that's because there's these underlying ideas about how the world works that are a barrier to what we want. So there's this basic idea, you'll see the graph on the left from a piece of research based on focus groups about making the case for progressive economic policies in the UK. There's this idea that the economy is a bucket full of money. And if you take money out of that bucket and say, help people who are fleeing a war somewhere else, or give people a second chance who want to, or help people get a fresh start in life by having education, most people will understand the economy by saying, oh, that means there's less money in that bucket for me, which is not how the economy works, but that's, if people have that understanding, that's how they will respond, no matter how you make the case for it. No matter how much you say, look at the suffering these people are fleeing, we have to help them, these underlying ideas will be a barrier to getting the policies you want passed. So what we need is alternative stories. So in that same piece of research, just as an example, they started to use a different metaphor for the economy. They said the economy is like a computer program. Right now it's being programmed to favor these people, we can reprogram it. And so I'm not saying this is the right message, but what I'm trying to give an example of is we need to start thinking of those metaphors ourselves that show here's how our solution is going to work. The climate change movement is a great example to emulate, because messages of extinction and threat and we're all doomed can create despondency. Whereas if they can showcase this alternative possibility, as a lot of countries in Northern Europe are starting to do by showing, we can have a completely clean energy economy, it gives people something that they can work towards. It basically puts a picture in people's minds of that world we want to see. But so the challenge for a lot of our movements, particularly human rights, is, well, what actually is that image? What is the picture we want people to get in their heads of human rights? And crucially here, I'm not going to go into detail on this today, but there's a lot of research that shows the way we talk about human rights, people don't see any agency for themselves. We actually talk about it in a way that feeds individualism, like human rights is a tool that protects you from governments, rather than human rights is a way for us all to live together and treat each other properly, basically how to run society. So one question for all of you to have to think about is, your organization or your cause, if you're giving it to your potential supporter as a tool that they can use to make change, to give them agency, what actually is that tool? For example, corruption, we often talk about it as, anti-corruption or transparency is a tool to clean up government. So, using this idea of corruption as dirt, or the one problem is sometimes corruption then gets abused by people who want to undermine the role of government in our society. And so there's where we have to be careful with our messaging, because if civil society is only about opposing government, we have to be careful because we actually want government to do quite a lot of things to achieve our goals. So we also need to promote our vision of how government should be. So what I want to share very briefly is some ways you can get started on trying to talk about your solutions and what you stand for, which is running A/B tests on Facebook. So at Amnesty, I was trying to think, what's that picture I want people to see when they think of Amnesty? Or better yet, a picture that they would see and they would know it's Amnesty. And so I ran sort of old school animations in different parts of the world showing Amnesty about angry protest or hearing the stories of victims. but then also a values message about hope and also about humanity. So essentially what we're trying to do is focus our branding less on what we do or how we do it, but more why we do it and what we stand for. And so we ran these animations about our shared humanity. And these are just meant to be a test. And also for me, with 10, 15 years experience of doing public relations and exposing abuses, this kind of communication doesn't come naturally to me. It's not my instinctive way of communicating, but what I'm trying to do now is listen to audience research and achieve goals. So seeing ideas that I want to bring to mind in our audience. And these ads actually performed really well organically as well. We even had offices in different parts of the world making stickers out of them. So the message is it's quite hard to make this shift to start. It feels almost naive to talk about things like love and caring and kindness. But basically, those are synonyms for solidarity. We just need to make it real in the minds of our audience. And actually, a brand process I led at Amnesty has led to us making humanity our core brand idea. And the key thing here is we're not having a slogan. It's about an idea that we want to make a more salient narrative in society. And so obviously the words might be used, but we're also in different parts of the world. People can use any words they want. The idea is to call to mind that shared humanity. And we're building that on the idea that the more people think of themselves as human, the more likely they are to accept policies we want. And I can give some examples of that later. But once you start going down that road, it opens up entirely new avenues of what are the actual stories I should be telling and the pictures I should be showing people. So for example, there's research that shows when you see the picture of planet Earth, it increases your empathy because it reminds you of your shared humanity with everyone else on this planet. And so that is an example of actually, if we start talking about human rights, not as protection from harm or a list of abuses or a list of entitlements that we want the government to give us, but more something that binds us together in shared humanity, then it becomes actually the best way to tackle climate change. So very quickly, I'm going to go through this a little bit faster, but what we want to shift to when we go from threat to opportunity is instead of telling people to feel guilty by not getting involved or having an implicit threat that if you don't protect these rights today, tomorrow they could be your rights, can we give people an opportunity to be part of change? So the old example is, I'm not going to show this video, but basically a UK child suddenly has to become a refugee. So literally trying to trigger that amygdala in the lower part of the brain. Imagine you and your family had to flee. That's a very instinctive way to communicate. It's pretty much the way I would instinctively communicate and did communicate the refugee crisis. But the brain science suggests that this is actually backfiring on us. So instead, what one example is Amnesty France built on global audience research that found, particularly on the streets where Amnesty staff trying to recruit new members, people want to know how change happens. And in France, they found people want to be part of something successful. So this is another ad that's in my playlist that you can watch later. It's with a very powerful Nina Simone soundtrack, but it's trying to trigger these positive emotions, the sense of change can happen, a sort of promise of, it may be hard today, but the promise of joy tomorrow if we can make the change happen. And above all, to be part of something successful. After all, we are a movement and we're meant to be moving towards something. So we do need also to think of like telling people that you can be part of something. Basically, because of time also, I'm not even going to give the details on this, but you can really see how the other side managed to make people feel part of something. There's also research that shows that people often get values from being part of a community rather than the other way around. So the pro-life movement grew by making people feel part of a community and then inculcating the values with them. We can do this too. I really feel that the other side are most comfortable when they feel they're being attacked by us and it's just a fight and they can show the division in society. Whereas when we unite around a clear call to action, a clear vision of the change we want to see, framed in very simple values, like we saw in Argentina last year, that's what scares them. And I can give examples from Ireland. So that raises a question for me then, if we want people to be involved with us, what are we to our supporters? Are we a friend? Are we the nagging grandmother? My case would be the nagging mother. But question to you is, of these 5 characters, which one do you think your organization best represents? And I know mostly my communication has been probably a mix of anger and disgust. I think sadness is actually plays still a very important role, but disgust and fear are emotions that are actually quite triggered to less empathy and shrinking your view of who's human. And so we need to be quite careful of those. Martin Luther King said that anger needs to be purified so that it builds towards hope. So a small note, now I'm going to skip this point on narrative because it's a little bit more technical and we can come back to it. I wanted to finish on the last shift, which is about shifting from victims to heroes. And what I mean there is everyday heroes. So the shift could easily be from victims to humans. So the obvious point is to not show the people we want to help in a dehumanizing point of view, but to actually understand the attitudes of, say, the group of people whose mind we want to change. So there's a group called Hardwired that you can find out more about on this. I mean, there's a very powerful idea they have. They basically seek to shift minds from those who would be disgusted or reject certain groups of people, how to shift them towards tolerance. And then later on, can you shift people towards acceptance, to welcome, to affirmation, and eventually celebrating. And the way to do that is actually what Hardwired says: if you want to change someone's mind, you need to show them someone like them changing their mind. So you're simulating behavior. And we can now track attitudes towards people over time. So this can be a core part of our strategy. This is a graph I won't go into in detail, but tracking attitudes, the sentiment of discussion on social media towards refugees. But what we need to do is show audiences people like them welcoming refugees. And the key thing is we need those things to be the story. So that's where we need our PR strategies, not just to be reactive to the crises, but also showing basically humanity, where the temptation is always to point our finger at the worst of humanity. We need people to also see the best of it, because otherwise they think that inhumanity is the norm. This is a very good example. It's called Look Beyond Borders. Basically, we're showing refugees having that moment of social contact with a European in this ad. And we know that social contact increases empathy, but can we also tell stories of social contact? And then, just like the other side push out messages of fear targeted as Facebook ads, can we also do that in a humanizing way? So I want to take the time to show you one ad in particular that's not on my playlist because it's of copyright issues. I'm going to show you 2 ads actually, so they're very, very short. So this was Northern Ireland during the peace process, and they'd started running ads about the bombings and the beatings and how bad the paramilitary groups were, but that was just reinforcing bitterness. So I want to show you 2 ads that actually sought to show the common humanity between Catholics and Protestants.
We took a group of citizens, Catholics and Protestants, to test the differences between people in Northern Ireland.
Hey, where did we go? Music was again key. Days when the rains came. This time, they were keeping it local.
So that's a very, very, simple and obvious point they were making. But actually, we need to start making quite a few more of those. But then there's another one. I'm going to find for you. So this is another one I find it's quite deep. They're both. It's an ad in which you see a Catholic boy and a Protestant boy basically have a nice day together. They actually made this ad to go with music that was given them by Van Morrison. But just imagine this ad in any situation of conflict or division today, and 2 characters from the different sides come together.
When it's not always raining, there'll be days like this. When there's no one complaining, there'll be days like this. Everything falls into place like the flick of a switch. Well, my mama told me there'll be days like this. When you don't need to worry, there'll be days like this. When no one's in a hurry, there'll be days like this. When you don't get betrayed by that old Judas Priest. Oh, my mama told me there'll be days like this. When everyone is up front and I'm not playing tricks. When you don't have no freedom. to behave like this.
So note I get emotional for this ad every time because I saw it growing up as a child, and I still have this picture of this video in my head. And so when I heard Martin, I was looking back at the Martin Luther King speech and how he visualized the world he wanted to see, which was, I have a dream that one day down in Alabama with its vicious racism, little black boys and little black girls will walk down the street holding hands with little white boys and little white girls. And I thought of this ad. And note the slogan, wouldn't it be great if it was like this all the time? So that's basically that Chile ad again, showing people the world you want to see. And the key learning from all of this is if you show people the world as you want to see it, that will start to become the new reality for them. It won't just be a story that they can relate to, it starts to become the new reality. So I'll leave you with the two basic ideas, but there's a nice, how do we actually do this? How do we make these shifts? And I feel basically what's the biggest gap we have is imagination. What we need to do is, and there's a Nike ad that's in my playlist, I really recommend you watch it because building on the dream idea, but instead of engaging with the stereotypes and feeding them, we need to put in people's minds a completely different idea of the world, show people how we see them instead. And so that's where I feel how we need to respond to populism is with imagination. And just finally finishing that is essentially, we need to tell them about the dream. If you don't tell them about your dream, who will? And if you don't tell them about it, it'll never become reality. So that's a very quick intro. I would have played you more videos, but I'll send around the playlist afterwards. And I'm very happy to take your questions. I will stop showing the screen.
Thank you very much, Thomas. That was amazing. You've even been praised in the comments, and you know that what you covered gives us all a very good insight. So just to recap the practical side of doing questions, if you would like to ask a question, you can do it in the chat, or you can just indicate yourself that you want to ask a question by unmuting your mic, and then I'll ask you to ask a question, just so we're not all talking at the same time. But we already have a little comment / question from George. He says, really interesting presentation, thank you. It begs the bigger question of why we liberals / progressives have always been reactive rather than proactive in promoting a hopeful, positive future. And it's something I was thinking as well, is where do we go? Yeah, how do we decide what kind of world we want, or what campaign do we want to choose?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question, George. I feel like one answer is when I was trying to encourage colleagues when I worked at Amnesty to stop saying not a criminal, stop saying journalists are not criminals. And the answer I got back from one very passionate colleague was, I just need people to know it's happening. People need to know it's happening and get outraged about it. And that's why I need to just keep saying this message. It's about raising awareness, and it's about shocking them that, oh, isn't it shocking that it's journalists and they're being treated like criminals? So I feel there's that desire that's driven by our passion to make known these horrible things that are happening in the world. I know from personal experience, my way of making the case for human rights is still never again. But I just know from experience that, especially with a new generation of young people, talking about the past won't work. We need to talk about the future. I think it's also challenging because when you, and literally I've been asked this as well, if we put forward solutions, we'll be criticized. And so it's hard to come out and say, we shouldn't execute rapists and murderers, we should give them a second chance. It's hard to say we should have a more open world where people can move freely. You will be criticized. And so I think there's that. It's intellectually easier to say, while in terms of work, it's really hard to go, to the war zones and expose abuses, but intellectually, in a way, it's quite easy to say, here's what's going wrong. It's actually harder to say, here's what we need to do about it. And so potentially, it's not a case of that we're being dishonest today, but maybe we need to take more risks with that imagination. And so when I do workshops now, I ask people to draw the world we want to see. And I think there's also a sense of that there are actually studies that show people who are negative are seen as more intelligent than people who are positive. And when people actually draw that world they want to see, and we're talking about, you know, experts who work 10 years in justice, human rights, the environment, development, they draw pictures of people holding hands, of people eating together at a table, of a beautiful landscape. And with all our, you know, high-level, you know, legal frameworks, we feel a bit ridiculous, right, when we talk about love and kindness and people holding hands and two boys going to the beach. But the key thing is we need to think about how we're making people feel. And I think the key thing that we need to accept in order to move forward is that all human beings, no matter how intelligent and rational, all human beings reason emotionally and rationally together. You can't reach people just on a rational level. You may think you are, but those frames, those contexts always exist.
So another question, this one as a comment from Dorota. She says, we do positive campaigns on NGOs, activities in Poland, and it's going great in social media. But we see it's quite challenging to get media's attention to those positive stories. Journalists openly say they're more interested in conflict, problems. What's your recommendation on this issue?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question, Dart, and it's something that you're not alone in having this challenge. The first thing to say is there's a growing movement for positive and constructive journalism or solutions-based journalism. And a lot of actual academic writing saying that the news media's focus on conflict and crisis is quite damaging. So I think journalists are aware of it. And it's a little bit chicken and egg because we only give journalists the bad news. If we only give journalists the bad news, when will they change? I also feel that the social media sort of push on media is also changing because while there's an academic called Zeynep Tufekci who says that what drives the current algorithm is anger against the perceived enemy, surprise, or something that gives you a sense of belonging. So positive emotions, you know, the news rule used to be man bites dog. I feel on social media, it's actually more dog cuddles kitten. As in, we can also make stories out of positive, surprising moments, like the video I showed you of the refugee meeting the Europeans. What we need to do is try to identify our values and think of what are the stories that bring those values to life, and then try and either, create moments that are inspiring and surprising and make people feel good so that they will share it on social media and talk about it. But also actually identify the stories that are happening right now that we ourselves are not pointing the camera at and bring more of those stories out. We also need to create our own media ecosystem. So we can't just be responding to populists. And this is where a lot of progressive political movements are failing. So for example, Modi won re-election. His policies were really unpopular. The BJP were really unpopular, but Congress didn't actually give an inspiring alternative for them to vote for. And so people ended up going back to the cult of personality. This is really hard for us in the NGO world, but we need personalities too. We need individuals who can inspire people and get behind that change because, first of all, stories run with individuals. You need individuals. That was the Beto O'Rourke video that's in the playlist I was going to show you. We need individuals who bring to life our narratives with their own actions. And I think we've become quite, ironically, brand heavy as organizations. We're all about the organization itself, not about the individuals. Just look at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So it is also the storytelling. And finally, also just putting forward bold policy solutions, which is, again, what AOC did with the Green New Deal. Because that's news too. If you put forward a vision of how things can be, and that's how the other side operate. They have huge amounts of money invested in think tanks that will put forward studies saying, here's why we need less taxes. We need to start also putting forward solutions of our own that media can cover. Maybe they'll criticize us, but we need to be ready for that. We need to be put forward bold solutions that set the agenda. So for example, in Europe now, Amnesty is working a lot on consent-based rape law. That puts the other side on the defensive. So those are some of the things we can start doing.
So Ingrid says, Related to this question, as a photographer focusing on empowering and positive stories, no awards or festivals are interested in non-victimizing stories, but they have a key role in visibilizing world issues and stories visually.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point. Actually, maybe we should make one. Yeah, I was just hearing yesterday about it, how FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, during the Depression, he knew that he couldn't just pass his policies. He needed to tell the stories of people affected, because people even today think that poverty is people's own fault. And so you know those famous photographs of the Depression, those didn't come about by chance. That was a decision by FDR to send artists out to the Dust Bowl and document people's cases. So we're not ignoring those crises. The point is we need to humanize the people in those moments. And so that's why I say victims to heroes. We want to celebrate the humanity in people, so that people don't see in those stories a victim or someone suffering, because that's triggering a pain response in the brain, but actually show the courage and the humanity that actually a lot of war journalists say they see humanity at its best in those crises. So it's also about how we tell the story, and that's why basically that's originally how I came to the idea of hope-based communications. There's hope in every story, and we just have to show that. But I think it's also, there's a big challenge the way I see we desperately need more visual thinking people in our movement, because I know at Amnesty International, for example, you'll see dozens and dozens of images of human rights defenders, but you just see their face looking angry, and you don't know what they do. What's the story? And so the key thing, that I go back to that shoebox, what is the picture of human rights? What does it look like to actually do human rights or any other of our causes? And so again, maybe we also just need to focus on making the positive stories of change just more interesting and more visually appealing.
So my colleague who's sitting next to me, Vicky, she has a question, so I'll let her speak.
Hi, Thomas. I've got a question about, in the nationalist context, the role of kind of patriotism-based pride narratives, because what you hear from the likes of Operation Libero and others is that there is room for, I'm a positive, proud, progressive patriot, and still using those kind of narratives. Do you find that a double-edged sword? Is it quite? Do you have to navigate that space very carefully, or is there actually a room for that?
I do feel it's a bit of a double-edged sword, actually. Maybe that's because of my own bias as a sort of citizen of nowhere / the world. But my belief is that human rights is about not less about the rights and more about the human, as in the fact that we're all human and that's how we treat each other. And I feel there's a danger that every time we try and use national values to mobilize people, we're reminding people of the things that make them different. So, for example, if we want to say it's part of British or German or Swiss values to welcome in refugees, we're actually reminding people that those people are different than you. But that's just the context. Nations are imagined communities, just like everything else. And I think right now what's missing in the world is people who stand up for internationalism and cosmopolitanism. And if you think about it, even the word international is already framed by the idea of nations. And so I'm not necessarily radically proposing some new way of organizing the world, but I think it's actually something quite prevalent in NGOs as well, that most NGOs, when they come together, they tend to come together at the national level. And also, when human rights activism started in the 60s and 70s, the key point was that me as an Irish person sitting here in London, I can have a say on the world stage about how people in Myanmar are being treated because they're human and I'm human. And so I feel that the shift, again, as I was saying, in audiences needs to be not about human rights and other causes, not just about the people they're suffering, but what we do about it. And so human rights actually is about me as a citizen being able to say something about that, because we're connected by being human. And there's actually audience research I can share, I think that backs up that point, that if people think of themselves as belonging to that group, that national group, they're less likely actually to welcome those people, because they say we should take care of Americans first. Whereas if we trigger this idea of shared humanity in people, think also of climate change. Why should we take measures if the Chinese aren't going to? I feel we need a different frame to address a lot of these issues. and we also need to start operating basically, I'm saying across borders, but again, I'm accepting that frame of borders. I feel what our movement needs actually is a new approach to these issues that doesn't address it through those national frames.
So I have a question as well. I think everything you've spoken about makes complete sense, and obviously it works. But one of the things you've also alluded to is one of the issues is actually trying to work with and convince those closest to us that this is the right way to communicate. So how do we go about showing to our colleagues that this is the way that we can win effectively?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tom. And I've learned some lessons on that over the last couple of years, because I sort of have the zealots, I've got a convert's zeal, because I completely changed myself in the way I see this work. I think at first I was just very struck myself about, okay, this is going wrong, and I pushed that message. So essentially I was saying, don't say not a criminal. So I was actually repeating the external messaging error internally. And so for me, the key thing is not to tell people they're doing it wrong. And also, you know, it seems that when I say hope, people think we mean, oh, you're going to be 100% positive. It's also not about that. So I feel those shifts are there to try and help people act. Basically, we need to gently nudge our colleagues to start trying to articulate, what are we actually for here? What is the solution? What is the kind of behavior we'd like to see? Can we show people how things can get better? And I have a few exercises already to start shifting people and like starting to see the solutions. I think also emotionally, that's audience research is very helpful, because we need to make people see that what people need to, whether they're in the dark or looking at a situation where it's dark, what people don't need is to be told how dark it is. They need the light. They need to see the light at the end of the tunnel. They need hope, basically. If you're a victim, you need to know people are hearing your story. So I feel like it's generally nudging people on the way. But above all, I think the people who want to go on this journey need to start articulating what we're for, so that there's something there for other people. So, you know, I just tweeted out last week, if you're about to write not a criminal, instead just say is human. Journalism is human. Migration is human. Abortion is human. So we need to also, just like we need to give the outside world alternative possibilities, we need to give our colleagues something to stand for. And so that's why that brand project I led at Amnesty was all about coming up with a shared values message, that basically that's the goal of all our work, is to push shared humanity to leaders. It's something they need to do, something we need to trigger in people, and we need to move that into the mainstream again, that idea. And I feel once we can start doing that, narrative as a goal can start to become something that unifies not just our organizations, but our movements. If we find that, and to me, the humanity narrative speaks to every movement, those values and narratives together, we can actually start working together across borders and across organizations as well.
Thank you. I just was wondering if there's any other questions from others. Please type them in, or if you want to unmute yourself and speak, you're also very welcome to do so. I think I've already mentioned that this will be recorded and we'll send it around, but Thomas has referred to quite a number of resources. So we'll add those in the email. I know myself, I've used some of those resources because another kind of question or thought I had was, and you've also referred to this when I was talking about this with Vicky, is how do I catch myself from using the negative or the fear? Because like you just said, like telling people not to use the phrase journalism is not a crime is using the phrase, and it becomes sort of catch-22 scenario to try and engage with colleagues and try and get them to think differently. And it's something obviously we would like to work on at the Global Heads of Division meeting. So again, I repeat, if anyone's interested in that, please do email me. But yeah, how do you do that? That would be, I mean, unless anyone else has a kind of closing question, that would be my final thought and question. How do we do that? Yeah, ourselves. What can we do with it? Is there practical ways of thinking that can help us change the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think your question, Thomas, I think it's the same as my last one, is about using those shifts. We have to challenge ourselves to start trying to articulate it. And perhaps the biggest challenge for me was kind of, overcoming my own unconscious bias, basically. Actually, it's been very helpful, for example, reading Why I No Longer Talk to White People About Race, because I'm belong to a minority of the sorts, and I always, it's quite helpful actually to, just understand actually, your own ideas, sometimes you need to challenge them. But for example, I remember a colleague producing a graphic with a heart, and I was, I grew up in the west of Ireland, where emotions are to be repressed, not expressed. And I thought, what's this? This is horrible. Then I realized, well, actually, that's the opposite of hate. So that's applying the shift. So I think it's definitely perhaps communicating less on instinct and more teamwork and trusting audiences and listening a lot more, testing your content a lot more. And I think, as going back to Dorothy's point, pitching our ideas as well, like never relying just on putting our content on our social media channel, but continuing to try and pitch our stories to media, even if we get that pushback, and trying to find a way to sell it. And then just one question on scarcity and abundance. I feel like on the one hand, it's so important that the Fridays for Future movement has a human face and there are stories behind it. And that's one thing maybe I didn't speak about enough today, is at the end of the day, what's really powerful is those individual stories. But the key thing is, coming back to the emotion we want people to feel, is empathy. People need to feel empathy for the storyteller first. So we need to use new messengers. And I feel social media gives us that opportunity to elevate voices of people who aren't being heard. Say women of color in Ireland, having women who had abortions have their voice heard. But we can't just do it overnight. So we have to look at that attitude change. How do we make, say, the white man in a racist community in the southern United States actually look at and respect a woman of color, for example, and hear her? It could be that that's a video of a man like him engaging with a woman of color, for example. And so on Fridays for Future, I feel they may be slipping into a little bit some of the mistakes of the past. So, for example, in 1968, pretty much every country that had angry protests had a right-wing government by the end of the year. So I do see sort of quieter parts of the climate movement pushing that abundance message, because scarcity actually basically is a message that helps the oil companies. Their message today is basically, in Canada, for example, they've gone ahead with drilling in the tar sands, saying we'll invest the money in climate technology, which sounds crazy, but basically there's the idea, well, we still need this for the economy. That's how the economy works. We have to keep drilling. And so we just really need to be bold in pushing alternative possibilities, I feel. And I think that's just the key point is that's our conversation with our colleagues. It's where are we putting the energy and the imagination? Because right now, too much of it is going into the problems people already know about, and why we actually need the energy is to convince people that these alternatives are actually possible.
So thanks for picking up that question from Pickham. So yeah, it's been a really great webinar, and I'd like to bring it to a close. And obviously, I'd like to say a huge thank you to Thomas Coombes. He will be available via his resources. I presume there's a website as well on the way, soon to be had. You can find him on Twitter. Do you want to give a shout out for your Twitter handle?
I've already put it in the comments. You can find it at the website. Also, yeah, I can share some details about sort of hope-based communications workshops. So while I haven't built my website yet, but I've made a few sort of flyers, basically. So if anyone who's interested, just reach out and I can share some more information about like how to put this into practice. And I'll also just share in the chat function a series of articles I'm curating on positive narratives. So some other people who are involved in this work, different aspects like neuroscience and examples of campaigns.
So there you go. Just to be aware that those the stuff in the chat might not be available after we end the call, but as I've previously stated, I will send around via email all links that Thomas has provided. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and have a fantastic rest of the day.
Bye everyone.